You are listening to NQA's Sustainability Simplified, your go-to podcast for all your sustainable verification and certification needs.
Hello everybody and welcome to this, the third in our series of NQA's Sustainability Simplified podcasts. So today you've got myself, Stephen Burt, the Carbon and Sustainability Services Director at NQA again. And today I'm joined by Richard Clarke, who's the Managing Director of Highland Carbon. We're going to look today in this podcast 3 at the world of carbon credits. So we'll look at the background to the options for some of the pros and the cons and some of the best methods to avoid the pitfalls around carbon credits. It's worth just sort of mentioning and trying to define what a carbon credit is in the first instance, so we all know what we're talking about. So a carbon credit is a tradable unit which represents 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent. They're issued based on the amount of carbon dioxide a particular project will avoid or reduce or remove, and those projects fund the work by selling those credits to individuals or businesses who then buy them to compensate for their own emissions. And that's where Richard Clarke comes in. Richard, as I mentioned, is the Managing Director of Highland Carbon. His background is as a zoologist. Highland Carbon don't just operate as they might sound in Scotland, they also have projects in England, in Lancashire and Northumberland, and also projects in Wales as well. Although I think the bulk of their work is organised across a dozen or so large estates in Scotland, operating within the frameworks of what we call the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code as well. So Highland Carbon are pioneers in the supply of really high quality conservation grade UK carbon credits. He provides these high integrity units. They're transparent, they're traceable, they're authentic as well, and that's led Highland Carbon to win a number of awards for their business over the years. I think they've been best UK wide carbon credit supplier for 2021, 22 and 23. They've won some Scottish Enterprise Awards, and they've also been finalists in the Environmental Impact Award in 2024. They've won the Green Business of the Year Award in 2023, finalists in the South Yorkshire Sustainability Award in 2023, and were runners-up in the Green Business of the Year Award in 2022. So that's some introduction, Richard. Welcome. Nice to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you very much for joining me as well. So I've given a little bit of background to yourself there and a little bit of background to Highland Carbon and what you do as a business. Do you want to just expand on that a little bit and fill in some of the gaps in my knowledge?
Yeah, sure. So I set up Highland Carbon in 2017. My background is I'm a zoologist. So my first role was actually with Chester Zoo.
Oh, okay.
Back when I was a lad. After university, I earned a master's degree in zoology in university, and my first job out of university was with the Nature Conservancy in the States.
Okay.
And it was really focused around raising funds to buy land to establish nature reserves that represented the best remaining ecosystems of their type around the world. But it was a global organization, but I was focused in the upper Midwest, especially the Great Lakes region, and that's where I became passionate about established mature forests and natural landscapes. I worked in the UK with the Woodland Trust, managing their business development team, and so that was an opportunity to really learn about the Woodland Carbon Code, because the Woodland Trust were one of the instigators of it with the Forestry Commission at the time, and I was really excited to set up on my own, really, and set up an organization which brought in elements of the Nature Conservancy, which is science-based thinking and maximizing yields for biodiversity, landscape conservation, and so on, with the aspect of the Woodland Trust, which was afforestation at scale. And really, the reason it comes together is because the UK is one of the most altered countries in the world, one of the least forested countries in the world. According to David Attenborough, at one point a squirrel could have gone all the way from Land's End to John O'Groats without touching the ground. So there's huge opportunity here in the UK. In addition to our UK projects, which we developed with landowner partners, we also source international units from commodity exchanges, which meet all the requirements that we'll probably talk about.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, do you know what? I've always wondered what the connection between your zoology background and what your carbon credit business is. So that's a useful link, and really interesting to know that you've got that technical expertise and that background in land management and forestry and all that type of thing. So yeah, excellent, good stuff. Thank you for that, Richard. Yeah,
you're very welcome. I mean, the exciting thing is this is probably the greatest moment in the history of the UK to rebalance nature.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there seems to be a lot of activity going on in the country around reforestation, particularly at the minute. There's a huge forest quite close to me, in fact, which was a plantation, and it was wiped out during that big storm in December 2021, and they've only recently cleared all the trees from it now. 95% of them probably had fallen over. But I did see a sign that they'd posted down there saying that they're going to replant it with native Caledonian forest species, which is fantastic.
Yeah. Well, native forest is resistant to storms.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
if you have a monoculture, they're sort of like matchsticks, and the storm catches the edge of it, and then it works its way through, knocks it down.
That's exactly what it looked like.
Yeah.
It did. Yeah. It looked like a stack of dominoes had fallen over when I went down there in the morning after that storm. Okay, wonderful. Thanks. So, Highland Carbon and NQA, we have come across each other and worked together as a part of the carbon neutrality verification work, which NQA undertake, primarily our carbon neutrality verification work, and sometimes not time, but sometimes our clients, in order to achieve their carbon neutrality claims, will work with Highland Carbon in order to source those high quality carbon credits that they need to be able to meet the requirements of the standards. And just in that topic, it's worth us perhaps just making some definitions around what we're going to be discussing today as well, because it can be quite a confusing world of carbon credits, carbon removals, carbon offset, and what do they all mean? So just to set some parameters around what we'll be discussing, the international standards, the ISO standards for carbon neutrality, provide us with some definitions of exactly what we mean by a carbon credit and what we mean by a carbon removal and what we mean by a carbon offset. So I'll just quickly run through what those are. Richard's far more expert than I am in these things, so Richard can correct me if I'm wrong as we go. But a carbon credit is defined as a tradable certificate which represents 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent that arises as a result of greenhouse gas emission reductions or from greenhouse gas removal enhancements as well. A carbon removal is the actual withdrawal of a greenhouse gas from the atmosphere, and that's undertaken by what we call a greenhouse gas sink. So greenhouse gas removals can be undertaken through, as Richard specialises in, reforestation and carbon sequestration in soil type projects. Greenhouse gas removals can also be achieved through things like sustainable bioenergy with carbon capture and storage at the end of the flue, and also by engineered type carbon removals and carbon capture and storage, which might be direct air carbon capture machines or engineered carbon capture and storage, again at the end of the flue of the emission source. Carbon offsetting is defined in the international standards as the counterbalancing of the carbon footprint by retiring a carbon credit. So hopefully that helps us to understand a little bit about what we mean within the terminology that we're using here. Do those international standard definitions, do those match with your understanding, Richard? Does that sound correct to you?
Absolutely. So where it's relevant with nature-based solutions like the ones we have here in the UK and that we also trade overseas, is that afforestation represents a removal because the carbon is being removed from the atmosphere, locked into the biomass. And you can say the same with soil carbon, which is a standard which is developing at the moment. Avoidances would be things like tropical forest protection, because that involves avoiding the destruction of the forest, which would emit carbon. And the one in the UK, which is the common one, is peatland restoration as an avoidance, because when you're flooding the peatland, essentially you change the pH of the water. It preserves the peat mass, and it prevents it from biodegrading and emitting CO2. So peatland achieves an avoidance. And in some cases, companies are happy with either one, and in some cases, they require only a removal.
I live in Scotland, as you might expect from my accent, but I saw some good coverage recently of projects that were being undertaken in the flow country. And the flow country is in the kind of far north, the very, very far northeast of Scotland. And it's one of the biggest peatlands in Europe, I understand. But the news stories I was reading said that there's more carbon stored in the peatlands in the flow country than, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was something like there's more carbon stored in the flow country than the country possibly emits in a year. Would that sound about right, I think?
Yes, so the flow country has recently been recognised as a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
That's what it was, yeah.
This happened very recently. So what's exceptional with the flow country is that a lot of the peatland there is in high quality condition. It's still flooded. There have been areas that have been damaged, because essentially with peatland projects, they only entail restoring damaged projects in order to generate the carbon avoidance. Going back to what we were saying a moment ago. So the high quality ones are already doing their job, but we can't trade those. But there is work in the flow country on restoration, as there is across the UK, in the wettest parts of the UK typically. But the UK is one of the world leaders in this arena. I think Scotland has something like 80% of the world's blanket bogs. And so, you know, you can find this sort of habitat in places like Russia and Canada, Scandinavia, and I think Indonesia. You get some of it in the southern hemisphere as well. But Scotland's a very wet place, and it's got the right sort of topography and so on. So we get a lot of them.
Yeah. Do you know, I've been involved in this field, environmental and energy and carbon, for long enough that I can actually remember peat-fired power stations.
Yeah.
you wouldn't get that these days, that's for sure. But yeah, cutting peat to burn in a power station to generate electricity, and it's still quite a popular thing. I mean, I've lived up in the Highlands for time as well, and cutting the peats is an annual tradition where, you know, people use it in their fires in their houses to keep the houses warm. But I think it's, generally speaking, very largely avoided these days overall. Another interesting term that you see now and again around carbon offsetting and carbon removal is the phrases ex post and ex ante carbon credits. Now, my understanding of that is ex ante carbon credits are related to greenhouse gas emission reductions or carbon removals that will take place in the future as a result of projects. So ex ante carbon credits are carbon credits where the expected carbon benefit has already been calculated and already taken place. So an example of an ex ante carbon credit would be, for example, I think an afforestation, a reforestation project. An ex ante one would already have taken place. Is that your understanding as well?
That's generally true with some nuance. Yeah, so just to expand on ex post, it could be a solar farm that was built 10 years ago, and they've already banked the carbon credits. So the carbon credits are in a way on the shelf. You can buy them and draw them down. So they're guaranteed.
And that's the retirement process, isn't it? When you actually buy them and then they're removed from the registry.
That's right. They're retired to the particular company. Ex ante is in future. So with our afforestation projects, for example, there could be a 45-year or 65-year timeline for the carbon budget for that project. Depending on when the project was planted, if it's long enough ago, you can at some point buy ex post units, but most of them are going to be ex ante. They will all become ex post in time.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah. That's a good definition to have to clarify it for our listeners today. Good. So we'll move on and we can talk a little bit about the carbon neutrality standards, which NQA and others offer verification services against. So the current one, or the ones most of our clients use at the minute, is the PAS 2060 carbon neutrality specification. And that will be replaced in 2025 by the newish ISO international standard ISO 14068-1. So we've worked with many clients here at NQA. We provide the verification services against the requirements of those standards, and our clients are able therefore to claim verified carbon neutrality status as a result of it. But there's two important things here. One is that there's hierarchies applied in both of these standards. So PAS 2060 requires the companies, the hierarchy which PAS 2060 applies is to quantify their carbon emissions, and then to reduce their carbon emissions, and then to offset the residual emissions. So it's a very high specification standard in that, you have to reduce as far as you possibly can before you're actually able to offset the residual. ISO 14068-1 goes one step further than that in terms of its hierarchy. It requires a company to quantify their carbon emissions, to reduce their carbon emissions through their carbon reduction plan or the carbon management plan. And then it adds in the need to remove carbon emissions before then offsetting the residual carbon emissions. So ISO 14068-1 introduces this kind of additional step in the hierarchy, which is the removal step. And that's understandable because PAS 2060 was written in 2014. ISO 14068-1 was written in 2023. And the world's moved on a little bit since then in terms of the understanding of carbon credits as well. But, we always encourage our clients to, and both PAS 2060 and ISO 14068-1 require it, the highest quality of carbon offsets to be used. Have you got any thoughts, any insight into the marketplace out there, Richard, and what's on offer?
I think the most important thing here is that whoever you're working with for brokering, which is our role, is using recognized carbon exchanges. So they're actually transacting in a way which is traceable, and it's all on books. It is possible for brokers to have off-book arrangements where they have a written agreement for somebody else to allocate units, and that third party will then be undertaking the connection and traceability. But that inserts some uncertainty, if I may. There's a gap there. So for us, we are actually going on an exchange and we are assigning it all in a traceable platform. That could be the international platform. It's the UK one that we use for our forest projects and for peatland is S&P Global. So that's one point really, is how the units are sourced and assigned, and then which frameworks the projects are in, what are the standards that those frameworks apply. And ISO introduces an expansion on that in terms of the sort of projects which are appropriate and how they can be recognized. I won't expand on that because we could do that for probably half an hour, but it covers the main points. The other thing that's developing now, going back to the ISO, which is an expansion on the PAS 2060, is the vintage dates of the units. So yes, they're exposed so that the carbon credit has already been created. That is there on the shelf, if you like. But the vintage date can be no more than 5 years older than the start date of the period that you're crediting the unit to. And they can be retired no later than 12 months after the reporting date. So this is a really important one because most of the projects that are on the commodity exchanges are actually older than that.
Older than that, yeah. It's an interesting distinction to make because PAS 2060, which is the older carbon neutrality standard, when it comes to carbon credits, it basically said, you can buy carbon credits and they must be a member of certain schemes, and that was about it. They had to be, for example, gold standard, they had to be VCS, the verified carbon standard, the CDM, the United Nations, the UK Woodland Carbon Code, and that was more or less as far as PAS 2060 went in defining what the requirements around its carbon credits were. As you say, ISO 14068-1 takes it a little further and defines it in clearer terms, I think. So it specifically requires, as you mentioned, that the vintage is no more than 5 years prior to the start of the period for the claim of carbon neutrality. They're retired no later than 12 months after the end of the reporting period. It needs what's called the additionality and the permanence to be measurable as per another ISO standard, ISO 14064-2, which is carbon quantification reporting for projects, and it needs the carbon credits to represent reductions or removals that have already occurred, which you mentioned. That means the ex post carbon credits. And it also requires the need for the carbon credit programs, which you've referred to be transparent, to be in a public register, to have the traceability that's required to be able to avoid double counting, and also to minimize leakage, which is, the offshoring of carbon emissions, which is what the term carbon leakage refers to. So ISO 14068-1, the international carbon neutrality standard, does provide I think a more solid framework overall than PAS 2060 in terms of what it's looking for. Now, certainly my experience of working, NQA have worked with many clients over the years in our carbon neutrality verification work, always against the international standards. My experience of it is that those standards do represent and the achievement of carbon neutrality through those standards do represent a real forward step towards those companies achieving a true state of net zero. So, for example, because of the hierarchies in these standards and the need for companies to reduce their emissions as far as possible before they then procure any carbon offsets for their residual emissions, we've seen almost all of our clients actually achieve the reduction year on year in their carbon emissions before they offset. Almost all of those have been, absolute reductions in carbon. A much smaller number have been kind of relative reductions in the greenhouse gas emissions, related to activity or production of the company itself. So, I believe the carbon neutrality standards do represent a solid step towards true net zero within the realms of external third-party accredited verification to those standards, and also within the realms of procuring the very best, highest quality carbon credits, such as Highland Carbon can offer as well. And, until particularly engineered carbon removals, until that market matures a little for, direct air capture, for example, or carbon capture and storage, for example, then the carbon neutrality is a reasonable step to take, I think. Have you experienced an increase in demand from companies who are coming to you because of PAS 2060 or because of ISO 14068-1?
Yes, I mean, there's been a steady increase of demand, but there's more interest around this topic at the moment. Just for a bit of perspective, when I set up the company in 2017, most of my sort of target companies who I was approaching didn't have sustainability directors. And now, a few would, but it was very much a developing thing, or something that sort of bolted on at the bottom of the organization somewhere. Now it's really at senior level, so it integrates into the strategies, the annual reporting for the company. So for medium and bigger companies, there is typically a sustainability team. So that's been a big change in the last, number of years.
So in terms of carbon credits, Richard, there's lots of information out there that allows us to determine whether they might be low quality or whether they might be high quality carbon credits. Things that I can think of, third party verified, validated, the biodiversity benefits that arise as a result of them, maybe things like water quality benefits, tying them in with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, all that type of thing. In your experience, you obviously see the market as a whole. What's your experience of the quality of those that are out there at the lower end and at the higher end?
I think the most important thing is around whether something is a formal recognized credit, and then to get into the quality end of it. So one of the common things that you'll come across is sponsor a tree. Whoever's selling the adopt a tree, they might make a claim about the tons of the carbon in their marketing, but unless it's a tradable unit, it cannot be used in reporting. And this is quite a common one that comes up.
Yep.
So it's really important to go back to some of the principles that we've covered around whether it's registered on an exchange, whether it's third party inspected and verified and validated and so on within a recognized framework.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. The other thing that I've come across is where organizations create their own framework and they mark their own homework, if you see what I mean.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
And that's the other thing to avoid, because then you're losing out on whether it's a standardized, verified, recognized framework that the UK would recognize, the devolved countries in our case would recognize, and the UN would recognize. If somebody's just invented their own thing and they've created their own algorithm for tons per tree, unless it's actually being inspected and validated within an official framework, there could be risks around that. So that's one other example to avoid in the UK. And you could apply that to the international arena where this happens to us. We get contacted every week by somebody who's creating a carbon project in Africa or India or South America or something, but it's not within a recognized framework, and they're asking me to transact with their office rather than through a commodity exchange. And so okay. That's another one to avoid. Your first point was really around quality, so that I would expand on that. Yes, there's certain projects offer a great deal more quality because of the co-benefits which you've covered, you've alluded to. These can be things like enhanced water quality, flood mitigation, increased biodiversity, a huge one at the moment. And that's something that we offer, which is, if you like, it combined within the units that we are selling here in the UK. We offer that enhanced biodiversity impact, which is our sort of unique selling point, if you like. So you get those co-benefits which can be combined, and some of those relate to the SDGs. A big one in the UK is socioeconomic impact and well-being.
Okay. And
that's because our projects, for example, are large. So there's a meaningful amount of resource flowing into a community that's undertaking the afforestation. So that's, supporting tree nurseries and groundwork subcontractors, forestry subcontractors, fencing subcontractors, and so on. And there's a significant amount of revenue flowing into parts of the UK where there's very little year-round full-time employment.
Yeah. That hadn't occurred to me, actually, those socio-economic type benefits that can be associated with these projects in the UK as well, within our own borders, which is excellent. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think the points you made about the need for external third-party validation, verification, inspection of these projects, and for them to be within recognised frameworks, those are really fundamental requirements for the carbon credits that are to be used for these international standards, and it adds to the credibility and the transparency of the whole process. And then obviously, NQA being an external third-party verification body providing verification services against the standards themselves enhances that credibility even further, I think. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The other thing, just to add very quickly, is ethical standards. So we have very high ethical standards as a business. We have since we started, so it's not something we've adapted to later on. And that covers a whole range of things. But one of the interesting ones that's particularly relevant today is that people are not cleared off the landscape.
Okay.
The last thing that we want is Highland clearances Mark II. There is a risk of this where financiers could be buying an estate and then clearing off the crofters and then just planting trees all over it.
Yeah.
That's something that we don't get involved with. And so that manages risks, reputational risks for the buyer. That's one example. There's probably a dozen more like it. And that's the sort of assurance that you really want, because ultimately this is a reputational investment.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it is, absolutely. There are risks out there, and there's pitfalls out there around carbon credits that's a very kind of interested and clear explanation of how to go about avoiding those, and also the enhanced benefits of them as well. That's great to hear your experience on that too. The question of credibility is an important one as well, because there is a movement, in the press and also at policy level around greenwashing, and the governments and institutions trying to clamp down on greenwashing as far as they possibly can. So we see evidence of that in some things like, there's a new European Union level directive, the Empowering Consumers Directive, and also the Green Claims Code as well. And it continues to allow companies to make carbon neutrality claims, but it tries to drive out those claims which are not credible. And it makes it very clear in the requirements for environmental claims, where the EU stipulates that any environmental claim that's going to be made about any issue, including carbon neutrality, needs to be based on clear, objective and publicly available information and commitments. It needs to be accompanied by a detailed and realistic implementation plan, and it needs to be, and this is the interesting part for me and for you, I guess, Richard, verified by an independent third party with expertise in environmental issues. So that, for me, suggests that, the kind of carbon credits we've been discussing today, those high quality ones, are the very best ones to use to avoid any claims around greenwashing. And from my point of view, the external third party verification of the carbon neutrality claim itself is the best way for it to remain credible as well. So there is a bit of a myth, I guess it is, that's surrounding the EU Empowering Consumers Directive, that it no longer allows carbon neutrality claims to be made, but it's not true. What it does is requires that any claims that are made are credible and genuinely contribute to environmental sustainability within those realms, the clear, objective, publicly available, detailed, realistic and verified by an independent third party. So do you know what? It's nice to see that happen. I'm pleased to see the drive towards making any carbon neutrality claims absolutely genuine and credible, and avoiding any attempts at greenwashing. So I'm pleased to see that happening at both the EU level, and I think it will come to UK level in due course as well. One thing that I think is worth discussing is the range of costs that we see around carbon credit. So my understanding, which again is relatively limited, is that you can get relatively inexpensive, particularly international carbon credits. And then at the complete other end of the spectrum, you've got what are relatively expensive carbon removal type credits, which are focused on things like, direct air capture and so on. Then the ones in the middle, the sort of mid-priced range ones, will probably be the sort of UK based, some of the ones that you've mentioned within the UK itself. I think you can offer all of those, Richard, within Highland Carbon. What's your feeling around the costs for carbon credits and the general direction of travel there?
The pricing in the UK has trended up each year consistently. Afforestation projects are a bit more expensive because obviously you have the cost of putting a forest where there wasn't one, compared to say there is a forest there and we're going to have an education program around it, if you see what I mean. So, but of course they come with a lot of co-benefits that we've covered, and nature impacts and water impacts are very important to a lot of companies. So they're really investing in a project which achieves carbon plus various other things and a strong narrative. The UK price is in tens of pounds typically. Ranges sort of from 15 to 30 pounds usually. The international price is very wide, and it can start off within the voluntary market, around a couple of pounds, and it can go up to a couple £100. That price has been trending down in the last 2 years. What I'm noticing at the moment is that the projects which will not comply with our ISO 14068, their prices are dropping, and the ones that do are going up a bit, but it's still generally lower. So for us, what we do is we offer a menu. Whenever a company comes to us and says that they have a certain tonnage they want to offset, we'll offer them a menu and a few different scenarios, which can include, UK only, international only, UK combined with international. And in some cases, we'll be stacking them so they can buy UK and international at the same time to achieve certain standards and frameworks. So they can achieve ISO 14068-1, and they can achieve nature positive and the various other things that we talk about. So we can offer all of that in one. I think companies who are only selling UK projects and not selling international, they're going to have a harder time as these standards come in, but we can address all of that.
So that's interesting that there's the option for a kind of mix and match approach towards different sources and different types of carbon credits that you're able to offer. That sounds very attractive, I'm sure, to many companies. Okay, good. I think that brings us to an end for today's podcast. Richard Clarke of Highland Carbon, thank you so much for your expertise. It's lovely to hear that. Clearly, you've got a long-standing position in the marketplace here, and that's fantastic insight that you've been able to provide us into what, on first glance, can appear to be quite a complex world out there for carbon offsetting. But it's great to hear your input, and that's helped us to clarify lots of pieces in our understanding as well. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you, Stephen.
So thanks for everybody out there for listening. Please feel free to check out NQA's other podcasts within our Sustainability Simplified range, and look forward to the next podcast, and I hope you've enjoyed listening. Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.